Hi everyone, welcome to FY028 Inquiry-Based Learning. This is week 10, and in this week we're going to discuss how to write effectively using sentences, paragraphs and commas. And this presentation is going to examine each of those areas separately. So we're going to start with looking at sentences, and then in the next section, the second section, we're going to talk about paragraphs, and then in the third and final section, we're going to talk about commas. Okay, so let's start by talking about sentences. And obviously, at this stage, I'm sure you're well accustomed to writing sentences. You do it every day. So we're certainly not going to be teaching you as if you've never met them before. Instead, what we really want to do is just talk about how we can make our sentences more effective. Okay, how we can actually get them to communicate what we want to communicate, and how we can actually have more impact by writing them clearly and concisely. And therefore, throughout this presentation, we're going to take a look at different examples of sentence construction, and hopefully that will help remind you of the underlying patterns that inform good sentences. Okay, and that will hopefully help you when you come to translate all of the ideas that you have inside your head into good sentences on your report. Because, just to state the obvious, the better that your piece of work is written, the easier it is for the reader to understand it. Obviously, if it's not written very well and it's hard to follow, then it's going to make the reader's life harder to actually understand it, and they're going to lose interest. Okay, so it's in our best interests to be able to express ideas clearly and correctly. So if we consider the three examples that were given here at the bottom of this slide, let's start with the first one. Andy reads quickly, full stop. This is a very short sentence, but it is a complete sentence. It expresses the idea in its entirety. We have a subject, which is Andy. He does something, it's a verb, he reads, and then we have a descriptive term as to how he goes about reading. Technically this is an adverb because it describes a verb, but regardless, it explains how he goes about reading. He does it quickly. Okay, so three simple words which communicate a full idea: who it is, what he does, and how he does it. Okay, Andy reads quickly, full stop. Okay, but if we consider the second example, when Andy reads, full stop, it's kind of waiting for something else, isn't it? We kind of want to know more. What happens when Andy reads? We're kind of waiting for further information, aren't we? So that's, whilst it's a very short sentence, it's not a complete sentence, is it? It contains most of the information that was in the first sentence, Andy and what he does, but we don't get any information about how he does it or what happens when he does it. And indeed, the actual starting word, when, kind of assumes that something's going to happen when. Again, it's an adverb. It's based on time, isn't it? When this, then this. Something has to take place, and when it does, something happens. Okay? So if we have a look now at the third example, we see the information that we're looking for. When Andy reads, comma, he reads quickly. Okay, we get the resolution. We get what we were looking for. When Andy reads, he reads quickly. Okay, we find out what happens when he reads. Okay, so I appreciate that might sound basic, it might appear obvious, but these are some of the fundamentals that we need to think about when we write our sentences. Do they actually communicate an idea in its full extent, in its entirety? Okay, we can't have half a sentence. Okay, we can certainly split the sentence up into different sections as we put pauses in with commas. We're going to come on and have a look at that later. But a full sentence should explain an idea in its entirety. And then the next sentence either builds upon the first or communicates something different. Okay, so let's have a look at some more examples then. And here we see some examples of some incomplete sentences again. So if you have a look at the first bullet point, there is another theory, full stop, which should be ignored, full stop. Okay, so The first sentence possibly would stand on its own. There is another theory. But the second sentence, which should be ignored, really kind of joins on to the first one, doesn't it? It's referring to the first theory. So therefore, in the second bullet point, it would make sense to actually join them together as they refer to the same theory. So a better sentence would be, there is another theory, comma, which should be ignored, full stop. And the same again with the third bullet point. The proposal was finally rejected, full stop, although they considered it, full stop. Again, because the second sentence does actually refer to the first sentence, it would be much better to actually join them together into a complete sentence because they refer to the same object. Okay, so in the fourth bullet point, we could reorder it to say, although they considered the proposal, comma, it was finally rejected, full stop. Again, it's the same example. Because we've got two separate sentences in bullet points 1 and 3, the first sentence technically would stand alone, but the second sentences refer to the subject and the object of the first sentence. Therefore, it would make sense either to build a complete sentence out of it with something else in it, but because those are conjunctions, they're joining words, which and although, it would make sense to build them into a full sentence. Okay, and actually that's a good test for yourself to actually read your sentences and say, would the sentence actually stand alone? Does it communicate a full idea in its entirety? Okay, if it doesn't, then perhaps I need to think about reordering the sentence. And following on from that, here in this slide, we actually see that there's a technical word to describe the different parts of a sentence, and that is clauses. And there are two different types of clauses. There are independent clauses and dependent clauses. So independent clauses are clauses that can stand alone. So if we look back to the previous slide, we'll see that that actually refers to the first sentences in bullet points 1 and 3, because those can stand alone in their own right. Okay, they're full ideas that don't depend on anything else to be complete. Okay, but if we have a look at the second sentences in those bullet points, we see that those don't stand alone. So therefore, these could be known as the dependent clauses. They actually depend on something else to be a complete sentence. Okay, so these are the technical words that we use, clauses, for parts of sentences. Okay, and of course in bullet points 2 and 4, we put them together to create a full sentence separated by comma, but those two parts could be referred to as the independent clause and the dependent clause. Okay, so this is starting to give us a template, a pattern for the types of sentences that we'd see on a regular basis. I mean, sometimes you would see short, sharp, full sentences, usually for impact. Okay, that's also part of it, just to be punchy and concise and get something across to a reader, maybe to shock them or to surprise them. But usually we would see that idea expanded upon and more meaning added to it. Okay, because the independent clause would tend to state something referring to a subject or an object, but then the dependent clause, of course, adds meaning regarding why or how or when, or some other detail that describes the subject or the object or the scenario in a bit more detail. So this is usually what we'd see the most of, okay? Sentences consisting of a independent clause joined with a dependent clause. Okay, but just to finish off the slide here, you'll see at the bottom we've got an example of a very short but full sentence. The essay was late. That's full. That's a full standalone complete sentence. So therefore that refers to the independent clause. So we've had a look at independent clauses and dependent clauses. And we said that an independent clause is usually expressed as a full sentence, okay? And we've seen examples of short sentences in the previous slides. And we've also seen examples of sentences with two parts, but they feature an independent clause and a dependent clause. Now we're going to have a look at compound sentences, which feature two independent clauses. When we want to have sentences which describe ideas in detail, then often we're going to have to join at least two or sometimes more ideas or parts of a sentence together. Okay, and there's a number of different ways to do that. And that might be through the use of punctuation, whether that's a comma, we've seen that being used before, or a semicolon, or indeed an actual joining word. Here we see some simple examples such as so and yet or but. Okay, so here, if we have a look at the bullet points, you'll see that we actually expand upon the previous sentence, the simple short sentence of the essay was late, comma, so he lost marks. Okay, we've added a second part to that to explain a little bit more about the consequences of the essay being late. Okay, technically, he lost marks could stand as another standalone sentence. Okay, we could actually put a full stop after the essay was late. The essay was late, full stop. He lost marks, full stop. But I would caution against using too many short, sharp and simple sentences, otherwise our writing is going to read like this list, essentially without bullet points, if it's just one short sentence after another. Okay, it's going to be a bit jerky, not pleasant to read through. Okay, be a bit like notes, just without bullet points. Okay, so we want to try and work towards full sentences. I'm not saying don't use simple sentences. They certainly can be good for adding impact, especially at the start of a piece of work. Something that's shocking or surprising, or something that's going to grab their attention right from the word go. Okay, that's a very common writing technique. But I would certainly advise caution with using too many of them. It'd be much better to use full and descriptive sentences just to make the writing flow better. Okay, so you do be working towards joining. So do try and join your sentences together to add detail and expand upon ideas. Okay, so here in the second bullet point, we just see another example. Rather than using the joining word so, we actually just see a semicolon after the essay was late, and then he lost marks, full stop. Okay, so that's just another example where we don't need to have a joining word, but instead we can just have a semicolon. Okay, again, I wouldn't use it every sentence, but just occasionally is good to add variety, because again, it is a little bit jerky. It is just a way to join the two separate sentences. Remember, they could stand in their own right. They are full ideas. But here is just an easy way to actually join them together with a piece of punctuation instead of a full stop. Okay, again, it's useful in occasional circumstances, but be best to add joining words, I think. That's certainly what you see more common in writing that you read. So I would certainly gently persuade you to use the first bullet point more than the second bullet point. Not saying that you can't use the second bullet point, but just use it wisely, use it sparingly. So we've seen how joining two independent clauses together creates a compound sentence, but here we're going to have a look at creating complex sentences, which is actually the joining of an independent clause with a dependent clause. And yes, we have actually looked at this before. A few slides back, you'll probably remember we talked about independent clauses and dependent clauses. At the time, we just didn't call them complex sentences, but that's what they were. They were complex sentences. And here, we're going to talk about it in further detail. Okay, so if you have a look at the first example, we actually lead with the dependent clause. You'll notice here it's in italics. Because his essay was late, comma, he lost marks, full stop. Okay, so the independent clause is he lost marks. that stands alone. And the dependent clause is the start of the sentence, because his essay was late. Okay, and you notice there we've actually got a comma to add a pause between the dependent and the independent. Okay, and that's because we start with the dependent. We have to add a little bit of space to then give the resolve, don't we? Because his essay was late, notice the pause, he lost marks. And actually, if you read it without the pause, you'd notice the difference. Okay, listen to this. Because his essay was late, he lost marks. All right, and notice I didn't pause there. And notice how different that sounds to because his essay was late, he lost marks. It kind of sounds as if it does need a pause there. So that's commonly why we see a comma. All right, because his essay was late, pause, he lost marks. Okay, but if you reorder the sentence, if you have a look at the last bullet point, we've reordered it to start with the independent clause. He lost marks because his essay was late. Notice there that we've reordered it so that we don't actually need the pause anymore. It actually flows and reads a little bit easier this way round, doesn't it? Listen to it again. He lost marks because the essay was late. As opposed to, because the essay was late, comma, he lost marks. So both of them work, there's just subtle differences in the way that they sound when they're read or actually spoken out loud. Okay, so it's not saying that one is necessarily better than the other. It's not saying that the first example doesn't work. Indeed, you'll see examples of this when you read through different writing out there. But it's just thinking about the format that's required. Okay, if you lead with the dependent clause, you'll have to have a pause in there. But if you lead with the independent clause, then it won't require a comma. Instead, it'll only probably need a joining word, because, and, but, so, yet, etc. Okay, so just a subtle difference there to be paying attention to. And actually, the effect of starting with the dependent clause means that it then emphasizes the independent clause at the end. Because his essay was late, he lost marks. Okay, that's the bit you remember. He lost marks. The because the essay was late is kind of like the lead up to the main point, isn't it? Because the essay was late, he lost marks. All right, that's the emphasis of that sentence. And here, at the bottom of this slide, we see another example. Although there were many dissenters, many of whom were prominent citizens, the policy still stands today. Okay, again, it's the same format. The dependent clause is kind of like the lead up to the main point. It's adding in the detail and the meaning to get you to the main point. Okay, so using words such as although, as, because, even though, if, instead, through, when, wherever, where, while, are all good and common ways to start with a dependent clause. Okay, so this can actually add extra impact to your writing and actually help to convey that point you're trying to make with more emphasis. Next, we can actually merge both the compound sentence and the complex sentence to get a compound complex sentence. Okay, we can actually put the two together. So if you have a look at this example here, you'll see that the central independent clause actually combines the two sentence types. Okay, it serves as both the ending of the complex sentence and the beginning of the compound sentence. Let's have a look at it. So when considering owning a pet, comma, you must calculate the cost, comma, or the animal may suffer, full stop. Okay, so that central part, you must calculate the cost, actually acts as the independent clause, which combines two dependent clauses. Okay, because when considering owning a pet won't stand alone, and or the animal may suffer wouldn't actually stand alone. And this is actually the typical rule for combining both the compound and the complex sentence. Okay, we've got to begin with the dependent clause, because if we start with the independent clause and then go on to have two dependent clauses, that's going to be a long sentence and may not flow as well. All right, so the best format is to start with a dependent clause and then have your independent clause in the center. Okay, and then you can end with extra information in the form of a dependent clause. Okay, so now that we've covered lots of different sentence types, we've had a look at the simple sentence, the compound sentence, the complex sentence, the compound complex sentence, as well as all the different varieties of dependent clause used with independent clause and punctuation and different joining words. We've had a look at all those in isolation. Now let's see if we can use them together in some more, let's say, comprehensive examples of writing. So looking at the first bullet point here, we see that we're actually just using simple sentences. Jackie is confident, full stop. She is a good speaker. She is considered to be an excellent presenter. Everyone finds her interesting. No one has been critical. She is supportive of others. Okay, whilst it works and grammatically is correct, it's a bit jerky. It doesn't flow that nicely, does it? So if we have a look at the second example here, notice how we've actually used a variety of different sentence types to say all the same things, but in a format that actually reads a little bit better, reads a bit more nicely. Okay, so let's have a listen to this. Jackie is confident and she is a good speaker. She is considered to be an excellent presenter. Everyone finds her interesting, and no one has been critical as she is supportive of others. Notice how that said all the same things as the first example of short, sharp, simple sentences, but it actually sounded a little bit more pleasant to the ears. Okay, it wasn't just a list. We weren't just bombarded with a list of descriptions and attributes of Jackie. Okay, we actually put those things together to form something that would be easier to read and easier to listen to. Okay, and let's consider another example now. In the first bullet point of this slide, notice how we have one long sentence which just has lots of pauses in it. Okay, let's see if I can do it in one breath. If you consider buying a puppy, whatever age or breed, always consider the type of house you have, as this is the most important final step, because without considering this first, you can find yourself with a dog that, despite your good intentions, you just cannot keep. And breathe. Okay, that was a lot. Whilst we could read it slower and have longer pauses, the full stop is kind of giving me more license to take a break and take a breath. Okay, so hopefully that illustrated, what that might be like for a reader to actually read it. I appreciate I read it out loud, but even if you were just reading it in your head and not out loud, that would still be a lot of scanning in one go. Okay, that's a long sentence, which isn't ideal. I mean, yes, there are examples where you can use a long sentence, but I'd say use them wisely and certainly not as long as this, okay? You wouldn't want too many short sentences and you wouldn't want too many long sentences. Probably a good marker for a long sentence would be the compound complex sentence, okay, where you have two dependent clauses which are separated by an independent clause. Okay, that's probably the maximum I would suggest in terms of sentence length. So let's come back to this example and let's now put some full stops in there. And notice here that we've actually transformed this into 3 sentences rather than just one. Okay, so if we read this now, hopefully we'll be able to read it a bit easier. If you consider buying a puppy, whatever age or breed, always consider the type of house you have. This is the most important first step. Without considering this first, you can find yourself with a dog that you just cannot keep despite your good intentions. Okay, so I could tell you that was much more pleasant to read from my end. I could actually take a break at the full stop and catch a breath, okay, which I couldn't before in the first example. And notice here how we've actually put the full stops in the places where there is a relevant break. Okay, we're not putting these full stops in randomly, we're putting them in at the points where we've naturally finished the sentiment or conveyed the subject. Okay, so that's a good marker for your sentences. Best to check them through, and if you think they're too long, you can probably split them up and still say what you want to say, but having them as separate sentences not only makes it easier to read for the reader, but also helps to organize your sentences better. Okay, so we've reached the end of the sentences section of this presentation. Let's just summarize all that we've covered over the past few slides in these guidelines here. Okay, so these are some of the key takeaways of the past few slides. So first of all, to check the clarity of your sentence structure, try reading the writing aloud, stopping as indicated by the punctuation. Okay, so hopefully you found it beneficial to listen to me reading the different sentences aloud over the previous slides. Hopefully that's helped to illustrate the differences between the sentences, and it's hopefully helped to exaggerate whether they're too long or too short, or where the emphasis lies. This is also something you can do for your own writing. Okay, so you can either read it in your head or read it out loud if that helps you to better understand how the sentences will come across when read by someone else. Okay, so use whatever technique you find helpful. Reading out loud can help exaggerate the pauses and the breaks in the sentences. Okay, so let's move on. Next, ask yourself whether each sentence stands on its own as a complete idea. Okay, so again, as you read it out loud or read it in your head, hopefully you'll find whether the sentence is complete or not. If you find yourself breaking too early, then that might suggest you've got a dependent clause rather than an independent clause. Okay, so either join that dependent clause with an independent clause or reword it, reshape that sentence into something that will stand on its own. Okay. Next, use guidelines to either break an overly long sentence into shorter sentences or join abrupt sentences together to make the writing more fluid. Okay, so think back to the slide we looked at just recently, which demonstrated the differences between really short sentences as well as really long sentences. So ideally, you want a mixture of lots of different sentence lengths and combinations of dependent clauses and independent clauses, just to add variety, just to communicate your ideas in a way that flows. All right, and then finally, as we've just said, varying the sentence length and type of sentences whilst ensuring correct punctuation is going to improve the clarity of your written expression. Okay, so that sums it up perfectly. All right, so I hope that's helpful with sentences. Let's now move on and have a look at paragraphs. Paragraphs allow writers to divide their entire argument, let's say your 2,000 words, your report, into groups of related sentences. And whilst you've been given 3 sections to aim for, your introduction, your main discussion, and then your conclusion, those 3 sections, within those sections, you may well have separate paragraphs where you can relate and organize your ideas by groups. Okay, so this applies to any length of writing, whether it's a 2,000 word report, whether it's a 10,000 word dissertation, or whether it's a book length like a PhD or a novel or an academic textbook out there. Okay, there'll be different levels of dividing that entire piece of writing into chapters, if it's a longer piece of work, or if it's a shorter piece of work, certainly sections, and then within those sections, paragraphs. Okay, and those paragraphs are made up of a number of related sentences, okay, mainly organized around one idea or one aspect of an idea, and then a new paragraph talks about another idea or another aspect. Okay, so we can indicate that we're starting a new paragraph by starting a new line. You tend to see a line break between 2 groups of sentences, and sometimes we indent them as well. In some writing, you do see a tab to indicate that it's start of a new paragraph, but most commonly we tend to see line breaks, okay, a clear line between 2 paragraphs. And of course, if you were to read the section, chapter, whatever, within one go, those paragraphs represent a significant pause in the flow of the writing. Okay, so whatever level that's at, whether it's a small section or a chapter, those paragraphs are really going to help break the flow, just as you would individually with sentences. Remember, in the previous section, we saw how the full stop acts like a pause, a chance to catch a breath. At the end of a paragraph, after those group of sentences, acts as a longer pause. And when it comes to thinking about the length of each paragraph, there's no absolute rule. We have seen cases where short paragraphs can work for impact. Perhaps even a simple short sentence at the start of a novel can be used just to grab the reader's attention immediately. So short paragraphs can work, but also long paragraphs can work as well, especially if there is a lot of detail to cover and it's a long piece of writing, then naturally the length of paragraphs may well increase, okay? But as some rough guidelines, we wouldn't advise using paragraphs that are less than 2 to 3 sentences, or likewise, they shouldn't be longer than half the page. And again, we'd probably advise aiming for 3 to 4 paragraphs on each page of A4. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a rough guideline, a rough aim. Of course, fully anticipate that this may vary. It does not saying it's set in stone that it must be 4 paragraphs per page and each paragraph must have 4 sentences within them and they must be this length. It's not saying that, but instead it's just a rough guideline to get you thinking about how you can better organize your ideas, because ultimately that's the aim of it. It's to help you communicate a single idea or an aspect of an idea within that paragraph. If it's the case that you're trying to communicate multiple ideas and you're going into detail about those in a long paragraph, say that does span half the page or more, then we'd probably advise you to think about splitting them up into separate paragraphs and focusing on one idea at a time. When thinking about the appropriate time to start a new paragraph, I would say, well, if you're planning to talk about a new idea that's different from the idea that you've been talking about for the previous sentences, I would say that's a natural break and a natural point that you'd want to start a new paragraph to then go on to either extend what was said in the previous paragraph or to cover a whole new idea. Okay? And again, coming back to what we've been saying, it's a technique that can help you organize your writing into groups of related sentences. Okay, so it'd be better if you group all the sentences about a particular idea together, and then the sentences that relate to other ideas or other aspects of ideas, group them together. Okay, so that you cover all of the points and different nuances, aspects of a particular idea, a model, a technique, or a technology within one paragraph, and then that allows your reader to understand more about that particular option, model, technique, whatever it is. And then go on to another paragraph where you can then talk more about another option or technique or further build upon something else of the previous model, whatever it is. Okay, so it's really just helping you to group your sentences by topic or theme or aspect. Okay, so again, there's no hard and fast rule, but it would just be better to group your writing so that you're not constantly referring to lots of different ideas in the same paragraph. And so as each chapter gets broken down into sections, and then each section gets broken down into paragraphs, each paragraph can be broken down into sentences. Okay, and then that means that there's a particular structure that can help to form the introduction of a paragraph, the main point of the paragraph, and then the conclusion of a paragraph. And just like your report has an introduction section, a discussion section, the main point, and then a conclusion section, so do paragraphs. Okay, so you can use that structure, which is applied to larger pieces of writing. You can use that same structure to your smaller sections and paragraphs. Okay, you might have an introductory paragraph, a discussion point paragraphs, and then conclusion paragraphs. And then within those, you apply the same structure of an introductory sentence, introducing the paragraph, and then the discussion of the idea or further detail in the middle of the paragraph, and then the conclusion sentence of the paragraph. All right. And if you have a look at the bottom of this slide, you'll see that we've got an example of a paragraph which conveys the introduction, develops the main point, and then has a conclusion to it. Okay, so let's have a look at it. So the first sentence, which is, self-assessment can also develop skills which make a student more attractive to prospective employers. Okay, that's the introduction to the paragraph. So we know, or at least we expect, that this paragraph is going to explain more about how that happens. Okay, so starting from the second sentence, employers value students with skills in self-assessment because these types of skills are relevant to a wide range of employment contexts. They want graduates who can accurately assess their own competencies in performing tasks. Students who can do this are well placed to take on responsibilities and adapt readily to roles in workplaces. The value in developing these types of assessment can be seen to go beyond meeting immediate educational needs. Okay, so here we get a bit of expansion. We get more detail to the introduction of the paragraph, giving more detail and explaining how students can become more attractive to prospective employers, the types of skills they need, the type of attributes that employers are looking for. All right, and then we're going to conclude in the last sentence by saying students who have developed an autonomous approach to learning are well set up for lifelong learning, which will continue throughout and beyond their working lives. So that not only concludes the paragraph, the benefits of those employment attributes, but it then also sets up the next paragraph if the writer wanted to go on and talk more about lifelong learning or another aspect of education. Okay, so I hope that's a useful example for illustrating how sentences can be formed and ordered in order to cover a particular aspect or an idea from start to finish. Okay, so now we're going to go on and have a look at more examples of the introductory sentence to a paragraph. And so when talking about the introductory sentence to a paragraph, if you think to the actual introduction section of the report, which introduces the idea of the report, it's a similar concept with the introductory sentence of a paragraph, isn't it? The first sentence of the paragraph should communicate, or at least set up, the idea that's then going to be explained in a little bit more detail in the following sentences, the kind of the main discussion of the paragraph, the next few sentences. And just to state the obvious, it wouldn't make sense to introduce one idea in the first sentence of a paragraph and then talk about something completely different for the remainder of the paragraph. I'm sure most people don't intend to do that, but sometimes if they're just writing freely and their mind drifts, they can end up going off task. Okay, so that's why drafting is important. That's why it's useful to reread your work just to check that you haven't got distracted and started talking about other very interesting information, albeit, but it may not be relevant to the aim of the paragraph or indeed the aim of the report. Okay, so just read that and bear that in mind as you're writing your paragraphs. You may not get it right first time, but again, that's why drafting is useful. Make sure that you just align that first sentence of each paragraph to communicate the idea that is actually going to be communicated within the paragraph. I know it's obvious, but just make sure that you do that. And so when thinking about how to start your paragraphs, maybe even just the first word, if you want to follow on directly from the previous paragraph to kind of keep in the flow, you can sometimes use words such as nevertheless, however, furthermore, and these are quite useful for either extending what's been communicated in the previous paragraph, or if you want to contrast what's been written in the paragraph. It doesn't have to be exactly aligned or even for what was in the previous paragraph. You might want to use the next paragraph to communicate some negatives or some consequences of the idea that was introduced in the previous paragraph. So that's when a contrasting word would come into play. Okay, or perhaps if it's not related to that paragraph, then you can just start with a normal sentence that doesn't have a joining word to it. Okay, and sometimes in the context of a book or let's say a larger piece of writing where you might have chapters, typically you see that one of the paragraphs in the first section actually communicates the layout and the flow of the actual chapter. So it might introduce the main points that are going to be communicated, or the main sections, or even if it's the first chapter of a book, it might even lay out what each chapter is going to discuss and the main points of each chapter. Okay, perhaps you might be able to do this in a micro form in the introduction to your report. You might just set out what this report is going to discuss, how it's going to discuss it, and what it aims to find out. Okay, so these are all things you can be thinking about, either in the introductory section of your report or indeed in the initial sentences of your paragraphs. Okay, so following on from the introductory sentence of a paragraph, next come the details, which are the sentences which are going to communicate that main idea that you've just introduced in more detail and discuss it further. And so there are a number of different ways this can be done. And here we've got some examples, such as redefining the idea. Perhaps it discusses some literature that may well even question or debate the actual subject itself. So whether it's a definition of an idea or a description or someone's view, it might well actually just consider all those different views of an idea. Or it might, in the second bullet point, give examples to the introductory paragraph. So that's where further information might be added to help illustrate this idea. Where it's not possible to fit the full example into the first sentence, this is where examples can be described over a number of sentences in the actual main body of the paragraph. Okay. Third bullet point, it may well comment on evidence. Okay, so again, if a particular piece of evidence is being introduced in the initial sentence, then the paragraph itself may well describe that, contrast different views. It may well look at different authors' opinions on this or particular research work that's been conducted and describe that or summarize that in detail. Okay, fourth bullet point, it may show the implications or consequences. Okay, so we probably know this as advantages and disadvantages or pros and cons. It may well discuss the idea from lots of different angles. So this particular model or viewpoint or technology may have advantages in one area, but it may also have disadvantages in another area. So trying to present a balanced view of a technology. Okay, or a model or a different piece of architecture, whatever it is that you're discussing in your report. All right. And again, this is a very common kind of format for discussing different ideas within your report. If your whole research aim is to contrast different techniques or models or viewpoints, then it makes sense to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of each one and then compare them with each other to actually get a nuanced and balanced discussion of each of the different technologies, where they're useful, where they're not useful. Okay. And then finally, the last point is examining opposing ideas. Okay. So again, I think this kind of relates to the last point we looked at, looking at the ideas that run contrary to one of the ideas that you're presenting, or perhaps an argument that you're working towards. It's also useful to discuss the opposing ideas or other viewpoints as well. Okay, so there's quite a lot of different examples there and different ways that you can structure each paragraph, and indeed the information that you intend to communicate will differ between paragraphs. You may well use a variety of these throughout your report, and I think the best way to have a look at how paragraphs are structured and how to get better at writing them is just to read examples of them. So I appreciate you may have finished reading most of your research by now, but maybe go back and have a look at some of the research that you thought was written really well, and then have a look at how those paragraphs are structured and see if you can note any patterns to that and see if they correspond with some of the ideas that we've written here. Okay, so let's move on and have a look at the final part of the paragraph, which is, of course, the concluding sentence, or sentences if you've got a big paragraph. But usually it's the case that the last sentence will close the paragraph, and that will either draw out the main idea that was introduced, or perhaps in light of the discussion, it may well summarize that, or may even point towards the next paragraph, which goes on to talk about it in further detail. And the one thing that the last sentence of the paragraph shouldn't do is actually introduce a new idea which is completely separate to all that's gone before it in that paragraph. Okay, so it shouldn't be a different idea to what's been discussed in the main section of the paragraph, or indeed the introductory sentence. Okay, so the last sentence has got to relate to the body or the idea that was introduced in the paragraph. Okay, and here, if you have a look at the paragraph that's been included at the bottom of this slide, we can have a look and see how that works. And just to save time, I'm not going to read it all the way through, but if you have a look at the note on the right-hand side, which talks about the development of the first idea to explain one point of view, and then secondly, to compare with the opposing view. If we have a look at that last sentence, in short, personal growth and freedom have to be provided gradually within a structured framework. Okay, so actually, this is the conclusion of kind of like the deliberation of those two views. And notice that it's actually drawn by balancing the two views instead of just repeating them. It's gone further than just summarizing the two views, and that synthesis actually results in something that is a bit more underlying than the two views on the surface. Okay, it digs deeper to communicate something that has been evaluated or calculated or considered. Okay, a pattern which could fit within both of those views. Okay, so that doesn't just summarize or repeat what's just been said, but it actually extends it further, which is an excellent way to finish a paragraph. So as we bring the section on paragraphs to a close, let's just summarize all of the main points that we've covered in the previous slides for this section. Okay, so paragraphs provide a structure for your writing, which enables the reader to identify and follow the developing stages of your argument. Okay, so as we've said, that piece of writing is divided into lots of subsections, whether that's chapters in a long piece of writing, or whether that's sections within chapters, or whether that's just sections within a report like this one, which is 2,000 words. And then within those sections, you have a further subdivision of paragraphs, which help you to organize your ideas and present related sentences together in groups. Okay, so next point, remember that paragraphs should have their own internal structure whilst fitting into the larger structure of the whole piece of writing. Okay, so remember we covered this, that as your report has an introduction, a main body which discusses the idea, and a conclusion, so do the actual paragraphs that make up those sections. Okay, so think of that rule of three again for the paragraphs, all right, where you have an introductory sentence, and then you have a few sentences which will communicate the main idea which is introduced in your introductory sentence, and then you conclude on that idea in a final sentence or sentences. Okay, next point, be clear about what the main idea of each paragraph is. Deal with it fully as it's necessary for your purpose, but be alert to digression or irrelevancies. Okay, so remember to keep on task. If you introduce one idea, make sure that all of the following sentences are aligned to that idea. As we said before, it's easy to get distracted and mention other interesting details, but do try and organize your ideas so that they are related to each other. It's better that you present one idea per paragraph. Okay, so when you're drafting and writing your report, it's best to be reading over it and checking it. And if you notice unrelated ideas within your paragraph, maybe that could then form a whole new paragraph which talks about that interesting detail which you've brought in. Okay, next, check the use of your paragraphs by reading the first sentence to see if it outlines the paragraph's main idea. Okay, so we've just mentioned that, we've just covered that. And then finally, the effective use of paragraphs can be seen in writing where the reader can gain an overview of the content by reading the first sentence of each paragraph. So this is a really good place to actually start writing your report if you're not sure where to start. It's actually thinking through all of the main ideas and main arguments that you want to communicate. And if you can write them as a single sentence, then you can actually form your paragraphs around those sentences. So let's say that you just start with a list of maybe 5 or 10 main points. Those can actually be expanded and discussed into 5 or 10 paragraphs, okay? And you can communicate relevant details around that. Okay, and that's actually covered by the fourth bullet point, which is to check your own use of paragraphs by reading the first sentence to see if it outlines the paragraph's main idea. Okay, so that summarizes that. Let's move on and have a look at the final point, which is the effective use of paragraphs can be seen in writing when the reader can gain an overview of the content by reading the first sentence of each paragraph. Okay, so now that we've finished the section on paragraphs, let's go on to our third and final section and talk about the use of commas. And even though we have this dedicated section to commas, of course, we have actually been using commas already in the previous two sections. Okay, so you will have seen them used in the sentences section and also the paragraph section as well. So we have actually spoken about commas in stealth, albeit, and obviously I don't want to repeat what we've already been saying too much, but in this section, I just want to concentrate and focus a little bit more on commas rather than necessarily the other aspects of the sentence, okay? And we'll have a look at some of the different purposes that commas serve, okay? So as we know, as we've seen already, they can provide a pause in a sentence. You know, think back to the example that we gave earlier, which was because his essay was late, he lost marks. Obviously, that comma in between the dependent clause, which we start with, and the independent clause acts as a nice pause to actually make the flow of the sentence better, rather than because his essay was late, he lost marks, which it works, but it's just a little bit too much in one go. Okay, it'd be nice if we had a pause to further add impact to that independent clause to actually emphasize that part of it. Okay. So that's one purpose that a comma can fulfill, is a pause, a way to join sentences, join two clauses of a sentence. And another purpose that commas can fulfill is to separate words in a list. Okay, if we have a look at this slide here, where we see some examples, let's have a look at the first bullet point. The fish kept in the ponds were eels, tench, pike, perch, and carp. Okay, notice those commas which allow you to list several items, several examples of fish within one sentence. Okay, that's a purpose which commas can fulfill. And also not just limited to single words as well. If we have a look at the bullet point underneath, we'll see the main reasons for the closure were low enrollment, poor learning material, staff recruitment problems, and inadequate funds. Okay, so there we have more than just one word after each comma. We can have expressions, okay, you know, more than one word in a list, all right? And the other thing to draw out about this is actually the last two items of the list, because you'll notice that in the first two bullet points, there is no comma after the penultimate item in the list. Instead, that's joined by a conjunctive, the and word. Okay, but there are actually examples where we would have a comma and the keyword and. Okay, if you have a look at the last bullet point here, you'll see that the choices were history and archaeology, comma, archaeology and sociology, comma, and ancient history. You notice there, as we're using the keyword and in the items of the list to represent two different subjects that are joined together, to save confusion, the final comma after the penultimate item, archaeology and sociology, helps to then distinguish, so it's not archaeology and sociology and ancient history all as one item. We can actually separate the penultimate item of archaeology and sociology as one distinct item, and then say comma, and the final item, which is ancient history. Okay, and I think technically this is known as the Oxford comma, which is placed after the penultimate item in the list, the second to last item in the list. Okay, and with the keyword and. And so we've already seen how we can use commas to join dependent clauses and independent clauses, but it should be said that you can also use commas where you might want to indicate a pause after an introductory word to a paragraph, say, or a sentence. So, for example, here, we actually put a comma after nevertheless. Many critics see value in this theory. So again, a similar stylistic choice to actually adding a pause to then emphasize the latter part of the sentence, okay? Many critics see value in this theory is their main point. Nevertheless is just the joining word to actually enable that, perhaps in contrast to what was said prior, either in the sentence before or in the paragraph before. Likewise, we see further examples of this. In the next bullet point, we see after the first decade, which acts as the dependent clause, comma, the changes were fully integrated into the system, full stop. Okay, that's the independent clause. So that's another example of what we've seen before. If we have a look at the third example, numerous studies, however, prove that the theory is inaccurate. Okay, so that, however, placed in between those two clauses helps to add a join and also an appropriate pause in the sentence. Numerous studies, however, prove that the theory is inaccurate. Okay, so that's also another case of a joining word being used, this time actually having a comma before it as well as after it, as it's placed in between two clauses. Okay, and we see this again in the final example here. The same theory, according to most writers, can be applied to language acquisition. Okay, so rather than a single word this time, we've actually just got a whole new clause. We've actually got kind of like an extension, kind of clarifying, just that it's according to most writers, not all of them maybe, but it does apply to most of the writers. Okay, so it's a way of adding necessary detail to clarify and further extend the meaning of the sentence. Okay, again, separated by a comma before and a comma after. And again, we can also extend the end of a sentence by adding a comma. So if we have a look at the first example here, the war was vitally important to Europe, far more than it was for Britain. Okay, so it helps to extend that sentiment about the war and add extra detail onto the end of the sentence. And this enables us to extend the sentence rather than having to start a brand new sentence. And they're risking making the sentences quite jerky if they're short and sharp, as we've seen before. Okay, and let's look at one final example here. To understand a particular culture, we must look at the whole of society, not just its individual parts. Okay, again, that first part of the sentence would stand alone, and the second part of that sentence could easily be formed into something that would stand alone. But if it helps to extend the previous sentiment, the previous clause, then adding a comma will enable you to do that. Of course, just to clarify, you can use commas in more than one way in a single sentence. For example, have a look at this example here. Notice that we start with however, comma, the role of the government in the distribution of bronze coins as pay to the army, comma, civil servants, comma, suppliers, and money changers is as yet unknown, comma. But trade must have also played a considerable part in the circulation of coinage, full stop. So notice here that we've actually got three different types of commas being used. We've got the introductory word, comma, and then we've got a list of items, army, civil servants, suppliers, and money changers. And then after that list, we've then got comma, followed by a contrasting phrase. Okay, so it's a long sentence, but it does illustrate how commas can be used for different purposes in the same sentence. Okay, you're not restricted to using commas only in one way per sentence. But of course, on the other hand, you wouldn't want to use too many commas in a sentence. Otherwise, the sentence is probably going to be quite long and be hard to read all in one go. So do think about that as well, whether the sentence would actually be best served being split up into separate sentences. Okay, at one extreme, you don't want them to be too short, as we see another example of that here. The university is large. It is close to the town centre. There are special rooms available. Advanced reservation is necessary, okay? Because otherwise it's just going to read like a list, all right? So you want to find the ideal variation between some short sentences for impact, as well as some long sentences to communicate extra detail, but then a healthy in-between of other regular sentences that combine information, such as how we've reworded the above bullet point into something a bit easier to read, such as the university is large, comma, and it is also close to the town centre, full stop. There are special rooms available, but advance reservation is necessary, full stop. Okay, so we've actually merged those four sentences into two to create something that is both readable and also communicates the same information. But finally, be aware that a comma can't be used to join two sentences because a comma is only intended to be a pause in a sentence. It wouldn't actually work as a substitute for a full stop to join two independent clauses. For example, if we have a look at these two sentences here, the people followed their own creed, full stop. They were willing to die for it, full stop. Okay, if we tried to substitute that full stop for a comma to help join those two sentences, the people followed their own creed, comma. They were willing to die for it, full stop. Okay, we do want a pause in between those two clauses, but remember that a comma is only intended to be a pause, not a link. Okay, so we actually would need a joining word after that comma. For example, in the third bullet point here, the people followed their own creed, comma, and they were willing to die for it, full stop. Okay, that would actually be a more grammatically correct way to join those two sentences. Okay, I've seen this very often where students will try and join two sentences together with a comma, but it doesn't actually work. So you need to have a joining word such as and or but or so, yet, however, nevertheless, etc. Okay, or actually, if we were to go back to our second bullet point here, you could actually replace that comma with a semicolon. Okay, that would be a grammatically correct way to join the two clauses together, but not the comma. Okay, it's either the semicolon or a joining word, which if you remember way back to one of the initial slides right at the start of the presentation, that was showed then. Okay, so that brings our section on commas to a close. So let's just recap the main points. So if in doubt about your use of commas, read each sentence aloud, pausing briefly at each comma. Okay, I've illustrated this hopefully throughout the presentation, demonstrating the differences between how sentences sound by reading them aloud and emphasizing the commas and the full stops and the pauses. Okay, if you do this too for your work, that will help to verbalize and help to illustrate how the sentences would be read if they're read by another reader who's reading in their head. Okay, so that can help you work out whether the sentence is too long or sounds jerky, or if you're breathless, that might indicate also that it's too long. You've got too many commas in there. Okay, so reading it aloud is a really useful technique to actually work out how your work comes across. Okay, so that actually does summarize the next two bullet points, where if your sentence flows badly or seems jerky, you've probably used too many commas. And also, if you're breathless by the time you've reached the end of the sentence, you might want to insert some commas in there, or perhaps you might want to split them up into separate sentences. But make sure you put the full stops in the right places, okay, where they're appropriate. All right, you do want to have full sentences and full ideas being expressed. Okay, you can't have half a sentence. All right, don't just put it at random places in your paragraph. You want to make sure you split up the sentence when it communicates a full idea and when the next sentence begins another idea. Okay, so just remember that when you're reading your work. And that also sums up the last point, where it is necessary to divide very long sentences into two or more appropriate sentences. Okay, so I think we've said everything we need to say on that. So let's finish up this section and also bring this presentation to a close. Thank you very much for listening. I hope it's been helpful. As always, do reach out to myself and Justin. Do send us an email if there's anything you'd like to discuss about the lecture content here, or indeed anything relating to your research.